by their feet. This particular style takes 3 to 5 years.
We've just been through a long period of history since the end of World War II, when Buddhism was in reality collapsing in most of its traditional homelands, but was perceived by the West and presented to the West as being in a period of renewal, revival, expansion, and growth. To put it into sort of 2 words, you can call it the refugee period of Buddhist modernity. Obviously, World War II was followed with a period of new nation states being liberated from the British Empire and the French Empire, variously declaring independence and experimenting with different forms of government. And it was also the period of the massive expansion of communism, something that young people today can very easily underestimate the depth and breadth and importance of. But certainly if you were talking about a young man growing up in Sri Lanka in the 1960s, or growing up in Tibet in the 1960s, or almost anywhere in Asia, the big issues hanging over the continent in the shadow of the atom bomb that had exploded in Hiroshima were the competing claims to democracy offered by communists, Western capitalists, and different opportunistic ideologies in the new period of promised independence after the fall of European empires, or the declared fall of European empires at the end of World War II. In that period, you know, most dramatically and obviously with Tibet and China, Buddhism was stamped out of existence. But at the same time, the phenomenon of refugee Buddhism resulted in a super concentration of competing claims to monastic authority in places like Hong Kong, places like Taiwan, and where they managed to get a foothold in America or Europe. Of course, many people were very eager to escape to make any kind of a living, and they were eager to preserve any fragment of their tradition that they could. Of course, fragments that made money were a lot more valuable than fragments that didn't. So you got sort of the unbelievable commercialization of something like Tibetan tantric sex practices that, you know, within Tibet 50 years earlier, only a very small number of people even knew the existence of. Any kind of black magic practice that people would pay for suddenly became of great importance. And, you know, when you're talking about refugee monks, literally homeless monks, often monks who have witnessed their home temple being torn to the ground, burnt down, books being lit on fire, and so on. That desperation in that period was understandable, even if the result was real corruption. Taiwan existed as a world between worlds, of course, but many monks who were themselves World War II veterans, or at least had grown up with the devastation of World War II and the Sino-Japanese War and the Korean War and ongoing wars in Asia, had grown up in extremely deprived circumstances with very limited education. In Taiwan, in that context, you had many monks presented with the impossible task of reconciling several different traditions of Buddhism, several different lineages, under one roof of one temple. That we presented with the task saying, okay, we're going to incorporate a straight-up Maitreya worshipping tradition, some kind of mixed Guanyin and Pure Land tradition, and some Zen lineage that had a completely different set of religious practices, and that may or may not have been linked to Japan until 5 minutes ago. They may or may not be in a hurry to cleanse themselves of their connection to the Japanese Empire. Instant reformation was needed. Instant top-down hierarchical reform was needed, with some kind of legitimacy that would appeal to the public, to people who pay for funeral rituals, and that would organize the monks. So, you know, with all that having been said in sympathy, that's why it's very hard for modern Western outsiders to appreciate the desperation and intensity with which all of Asia discovered the philosophy of Nagarjuna in the late 20th century. I guess the mania for Nagarjuna really was something like 1975 to 1990, very roughly. Why did Nagarjuna become so important? Well, suddenly, in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, Nagarjuna was a definition of legitimacy in Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy that allowed some traditional practices to be maintained, others to be toned down, neglected, or rejected, that allowed monks to stake their claims to authority without having done a lot of reading, and that to some extent also re-energized the common ground between Chinese Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. Keep in mind that Tibet's own reformations had revolved around Nagarjuna and a commentary on Nagarjuna by Chandrakirti, this sense that the philosophy of emptiness, as it's called, was a central defining element of Buddhist philosophy, and that it was more important than a long list of other principles. That was something that had already proven useful in the reformation of Tibetan Buddhism. And so in some ways it's no surprise that in the midst of 20th century's many crises challenging monastic authority, Nagarjuna was useful again. The other thing, of course, is that you had a period where the kind of high-level literacy in ancient languages, including classical literary Chinese, was very limited and very scarce. There were very few people around who could walk up to the wall of books that's referred to as the Buddhist canon, or the ancient Chinese literary tradition in general, who could walk up to that, approach it, find what they were looking for, and with confidence read and interpret it. Now that is not to say that the world of, say, the 1890s was full of such highly literate scholars, but it's difficult to exaggerate the kind of free fall that traditional learning was in, including the disappearance of traditional forms of employment for people who aspired to become scholars. And of course that employment could include things like letter writing, simply providing scribal services to people. Through the Theravada world, of course, there's a dramatic economic and cultural change, because there used to be a whole class of people who were employed in physically producing handmade manuscripts. And then when that class disappears, the opportunity for anyone to really become a scholar disappears to a large extent also. So this is partly a technological change, along with the dramatic political changes that follow after World War II. And it's partly a scramble to create a new orthodoxy that could still be perceived as ancient. And of course it's very convenient if that orthodoxy can be boiled down to one sentence that everyone repeats again and again, namely form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And that one sentence doesn't say anything about monks refusing to touch money, monks... It doesn't say anything with the long list of monastic rules that were being broken on a daily basis, and that did, from an ancient perspective, define legitimacy in monasticism. This isn't something I wanted to talk about at length in this video, but it's something I wanted to reflect on in terms of the current crisis of Buddhist institutions across Asia. The intensity of the period of refugee Buddhism has now ended. What has it been replaced with? Well, the attendant enthusiasm for Nagarjuna. I've met a few older people who still are enthusiastic, in the truest sense of that term, about Nagarjuna solving all the problems in the religion. But they're fewer and fewer in number. The hopes of Theravada scholars all failed. And I could give a long video monologue as to why and how that was. Here I would just note very briefly that the very earliest period of success for the Pali-Text Society. The Pali-Text Society, based in England, is one of the very few published sources that made the most ancient Buddhist philosophical works available to the public. The earliest period of their activity was not funded from within England, but was in fact dependent on donation from the King of Thailand. Thailand was then a very poor country, of course, and still today it's much poorer than European countries. The interesting thing about the 21st century is that this same pattern has continued. Namely, that the rich countries go begging to the poor countries for the sources of patronage to pursue Buddhist studies. And anyone can look at that situation and see that it's the wrong way around and can't possibly work very well. Still today, guys like Professor Richard Gombrich go around trying to do fundraising, asking for donations from much poorer places in Asia, asking them to give money to England so that there can be Buddhist studies at universities in England at a much greater price. In terms of cost efficiency and so on, it's all the wrong way around. And so that England can build on a somewhat non-existent tradition of Buddhist scholarship. And the reverse has not happened or hasn't been successful. We do not have a situation where people from California with money are great patrons of Buddhism in Asia. No, on the contrary, you get a kind of list of millionaires from Taiwan and Hong Kong who spend enormous amounts of money to create Buddhist institutions in California. So that is now a tradition that's gone on for more than a century of money flowing uphill, money going from Asia to Europe and the West. And the results of what happens with that money, to say that the outcomes are mediocre would really be an insult to mediocrity. I've said before in my videos on YouTube that I do not believe the future of Buddhism can rest on a lie. I don't think that we can premise any kind of scholarly or religious Buddhist project on misleading the public. Whether that's, as you see, World War II hasn't ended everywhere in Asia yet. We still have the fighter jets flying overhead here. Anyway, with the two or three tropes I've just mentioned, it's pretty clear that now in 2014 all of them have run their course, and much of the Western world has also exhausted its own patience to waste money on academic programs that on the one hand have, of course, extremely little scholarly validity, and on the other hand don't generate money of any kind for the universities hosting them. So whatever optimism led so many universities in the 1980s to create chairs of Buddhist studies, there was definitely a period where it seemed that every university had to have at least one guy who could teach Intro to Buddhism 101, or at least Intro to Asian Religions. That has largely disappeared, and of course gone too is any hope that countries like India or Thailand would become great centers of new scholarship, religious or secular. Now I'm sitting here wondering if I could put any kind of positive spin on the end of this video.